In 1 Timothy 2, Paul says that he does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of folks because we live in a context where women are men. Well, not really, other than the really woke. But even among evangelicals, women can do anything a man can do, which doesn't really make sense because man truly cannot do anything a woman can do. A man cannot bear children. So why does a woman have to be able to do everything a man can do? This is what we call egalitarianism. Now, Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach. So how do they get around that? Well, they say, context is king. You have to understand that in Ephesus, there were these women who had been deceived. They weren't properly educated in the teaching of the Lord, and they were teaching error. And so Paul basically says they must stop teaching. He does not presently permit them to teach, ostensibly because they will in the future probably learn more and be able to teach. But does this actually work from the text? The answer is no. We can say all we want that there were women teaching falsehoods in Ephesus, which there's no reason to doubt. If Paul is saying he does not let a woman teach, that seems to indicate that somebody is trying to teach who is a woman. But Paul's response is not so narrow as these modern interpreters would like to take it. As we move from chapter 1 into chapter 2, we see those who have taken shipwreck, and they have shipwrecked their faith. Now, interestingly, Paul does not mention women in this context. He mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander, not Hymenaea and Alexandra. It is men who have shipwrecked the faith with regard to teaching. But he does not go on to say, therefore, I do not permit a man to teach. Instead, he refashions the bulwark of corporate worship, praying. And to do so, he says, first of all, I want prayers, intercessions, and so on to be made for all people, and I want this to be done in the assembly. And he says that he wants the men in all the churches and all the places to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Now, it's interesting that the word men is articular. The easy way to put this is we would translate it with the word the men. The. It's specific. So there are particular men who are called upon to pray in the assembly, and therefore this isn't just a general call to human beings to pray, but specifically to certain men. But then when the contrast comes between these men and the women, contrary to what we may expect given the current modern argument that Paul is specifically dealing with certain individuals who are teaching in a way that reflect that they have been deceived, Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach. It is anarthrous. That means it is non-specific. There is no article. He is not saying, I do not permit these women who are promoting falsehood in the church, I do not permit them to teach. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men. And that is a very different reading, and that is what the grammar says. Paul does not at all narrow his statement down to specific women who are teaching falsehood. He is making a general statement, and that's exactly the opposite of what these modern interpreters are trying to tell us Paul is doing. Over against the men praying publicly, taking a leadership role in the assembly, he says he does not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Now here again, the modern interpreter comes up with a different angle. They say, well, this word actually means inappropriate authority. I do not allow a woman to take inappropriate authority over a man. Well, why limit that to women? If it's inappropriate, what does it have to do with being a woman? You could just as easily say, I do not permit a man to take inappropriate authority over a woman. But that's not what Paul says. There is something specific about the role of a woman and the role of a man. And that specificity has to do with authority. A woman is not to bear that sort of authority in the church. That is not her role. You see, try as we may to say that women and men are the same, they are not. They are equal. Their roles are different. A husband and a wife do not have the same role in the relationship. A mother and father do not have the same role in the relationship with their children. God bless all the lovely women who have struggled as single mothers to raise their children in the fear of the Lord, and who have labored mightily so that their children know God the Father. But we do them a disservice if we say, well, it makes no difference whether one has a father. Or, well, she had to be both mother and father to her children. No, she couldn't be father to her children. She is only a mother. A very wonderful mother who has done the best with the situation which God has given her. But she is a mother, she is not a father. And that demonstrates the problem we have. Men and women are not simply replaceable with one another. That is true in the home, and that is true in the church. And that is what Paul says. Paul does not say, I forbid certain women who are clearly unqualified to teach. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to bear authority over a man. And he says this specifically in the context of public worship. So what does he say? Well, this is where things get very tricky. So what becomes unclear? Well, he says, for Adam was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but Eve, being deceived, fell into transgression. And so people suppose that this is supposedly Paul's very faulty and weak rationale for excluding these women from teaching. The woman was deceived and fell into transgression. Therefore, women who get deceived are going to be poor teachers. But that's not what Paul's argument is. Paul is not basing his fact of the inappropriateness of women teaching on this historical background that Eve fell into transgression because she was deceived. He already bases that on creation. Adam was formed first and not Eve. Adam is the one who is to bear the authority in that relationship. Now notice that's Adam bearing a relationship toward his wife. It's not Adam bearing a relationship of authority to every woman. Men in general do not have authority over women in general. That's not Paul's argument. So where is Paul going with this? Well, where he goes is he says that the woman standing in place of Eve in this relationship with Eve and the promise God made her, the woman will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and holiness with self-control. And now what people do is say, well, we know that women are saved by faith just as men are, and therefore they try to muddy the verse as if there is no point. Well, there is a clear point. Now, we overlook it because we hear saved and we think a certain direction. But in the fall, both the man's calling and the woman's calling were thwarted. They were compromised. They had been defeated by the serpent. And God makes a promise to Adam that he will continue to toil. He will continue to have a calling, although now it will be by the sweat of his brow. And he tells the woman that she will continue to bear children. And suffering, yes, but she will bear children. And what a lot of people do is they take that as a curse. And it's true, there is the administration of judgment intermingled with that, but we overlook that the fundamental thing that God says actually demonstrates his grace. Because Adam doesn't die immediately. Eve doesn't die immediately. God says, you will continue to till the ground, and it will yield fruit to you. He tells the woman, you will bear children. In other words, I have not rescinded your callings. I'm still giving you equipment in this war with the serpent, in which you have lost a very decisive initial battle. And then, of course, he says to the serpent something further about this vindication that the woman gets. He says that she will bear seed, and her seed will battle your seed, and her seed will crush the head of your seed, and you will bruise his heel. And we so often hear that simply and only as a reference to Jesus, but that is not how Satan heard it. That is not how the woman heard it. She immediately, when the next son is born, says, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And when Cain kills Abel, the same way that God says, I will place enmity between you and the woman, she takes that term place and she gives that name to her son, Sheth. That's the Hebrew term. So basically, she recognizes that God has given her this son in the battle, in the enmity between her seed and the seed of the serpent. And so when we come to 1 Timothy 2, this statement is not just pulled out of nowhere, out of Paul's hat, for the sake of an argument that he doesn't really want to make. He is saying that the woman generally, not universally, but generally, is vindicated in bearing children. And that has always been the case. That was what God promised. Now, of course, he says that vindication is not simply about the act of childbirth, and there is no reference to the covenant. There's no reference to holiness. There's no reference to faithfulness involved. Of course not. After all, Cain was stolen by the serpent. That's how the serpent gets his seed, is he steals it. But nonetheless, continuing in faithfulness in the context of childbearing is real vindication from God against the serpent. That is Paul's point. And so he is saying that there is a platform, a context within which the woman gains salvation, vindication against the serpent, where men cannot. They are not even equipped physically to do so. And so the primary arena where the woman is vindicated against the serpent is going to be in the home, as she bears children, as she raises them in the fear of the Lord. Yes, of course, there are barren women. God bless them. And God says that he gives a barren woman a home. He makes families for them. He makes families for the desolate. But that should not negate for us the general structure of the old biblical promise from the beginning. Now, when we go back to all of this language in 1 Timothy, what we need to notice is that if Paul is saying, I do not suffer a woman to teach just because of a few, he is being unjust. He really is sexist, because he does that for women, but not for men. But no, that's not the case. He is saying there are avenues for the woman to take her role, her rightful role, in the kingdom of God as equals, as co-heirs with men. And remember, not all men are called to be pastors either. Not all men are called to lead in the church. This isn't simply a matter of male and female. God has his own purposes, and he equips those he calls. But one thing is clear. We can talk all we want about skills and personality traits and knowledge with regard to women. But God does not equip a woman to be a pastor, because he does not equip a woman to preach. And by equip, I do not mean simply, does she know Greek? Is she able to understand the scriptures? What I mean is, he does not equip her with the authority to do so.